Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. We're going to talk about the Junkyard Dog Dark Side of the Ring, which aired on Tuesday, June 27th, 2023. Junkyard Dog, one of my favorite wrestlers, one of my favorites growing up too. Have talked about him extensively on this channel. I've done at least 2 videos talking long form about the Junkyard Dog. So if you want a breakdown of his career or some other stuff like that, I've done at least 2 videos. They're in the community section. You can check those out. This video is going to be mostly a review of the Dark Side of the Ring episode, which was excellent. It was very good, mainly because we got to know a little bit more about Junkyard Dog's daughter, and we got to meet his nephew, who showed us the inside of the home that the Junkyard Dog lived in. Now, I'm not going to go beat for beat here. I'm going to basically talk about some things that jumped out of this situation that I thought was very interesting. One being his nephew, who I thought added a lot to the episode. He added quite a bit to the episode. Another is the suggestion that Junkyard Dog was being paid for sex, that he was a gigolo, or in some cases, a male prostitute, and in some other ways a pimp, because apparently he was pimping out the boys. This is what they suggested. But also we're going to talk about the race baiting that happened here too, because it's Vice. And everything around surrounding the Junkyard Dog, the book was the same way from Greg Klein. It was a lot of talk about race and racial animosity, especially of the time and of that they kind of spin out of. So we're going to talk about that too. So let's get some of the good stuff out first, the feel goods. Let's talk about that first. So first, Junkyard Dog's nephew was in this episode, who showed us the inside of the home that the Junkyard Dog lived in. That is a tremendous treasure, with the pictures on the wall and the small bed, no inside plumbing, just like a big, like a box that you would heat the house with. It was very grounding for somebody who's kind of, when you think about wrestlers, especially the wrestlers who live glamorous lives, and there's tons of pictures of Junkyard Dog with like sports cars, and he looked a lot like Rick Ross, with the big beard and the gold necklaces and everything. And then you see where he came from, and you get that, man, you see why he was as humble as he was, why he was as charitable as he was. And that stuff's pretty historic too. There's a lot about that in the book by Greg Klein, The King of New Orleans, which is kind of a history of Junkyard Dog and of Mid-South Wrestling, which is, of course, one of the best wrestling territories ever, if not probably second or third best. It is a tremendous contrast that you see this guy who came from North Carolina, who had nothing. And even though he did not have the quote-unquote in-ring talent, he had everything else. He had all of the intangibles. He was big. He looked good. He talked a good game. He was personable. He had charisma. The theme song, even though it was licensed music, fit the character. He was a charitable, genuine guy that people really got into. So it really kind of makes you like, yes, he was a hometown hero. Now, when we talk about that contrast, let's bleed over a little bit into why it didn't work out in the WWF. Now, the top reason why it didn't work out in WWF is because, and they kind of tried to smear it a little bit here, was the drugs and the weight gain. That's what happened. In 1984, even before he left and went to WWF, even in Mid-South Wrestling, Junkyard Dog was actually starting to gain weight. Now, he was starting to gain weight because he wasn't working out enough. And he wasn't working out because he was too busy doing drugs. Now, he was doing drugs in the 70s, late 70s. In fact, there's a story in the Pain and Passion book that was written on the Hart family, which featured a passage about the Junkyard Dog being the first person to introduce the Dynamite Kid to steroids. So let's go through that. This is from Pain and Passion, which was a very, very excellent book on the Hart family and the history of wrestling in Calgary. Now, the reason why this is important is because Junkyard Dog had already went to Mid-South, and he was a bit of a washout. Leroy McGurk, who was the guy who ran that territory before Bill Watts came in and bought in, he wasn't really a big fan of black people. Also wasn't a big fan of Junkyard Dog, who couldn't really work. Bill Watts decided, hey, we'll send the guy off, let him get more experience, we'll bring him back later, which is exactly what happened. So technically, they sent Junkyard Dog kind of on excursion. And in this excursion, they sent him to Calgary. Jake the Snake Roberts was sent with him. So, because Jake Roberts' dad also worked at Mid-South, Grizzly Smith. So, they sent him up to Calgary. This is the setting up the scene for Junkyard Dog introducing Dynamite Kid to steroids. It says, Dynamite Kid was introduced to steroids in the summer of 1979 by a 280-pound wrestler named Sylvester Ritter. Stu had christened him Big Daddy Ritter, a white, womanizing black stud who angered the hell out of men in the predominantly white audience. Ritter, who hailed from North Carolina, was not a great wrestler, but his cocky charisma riled up fans. Stu gave him a big push in Calgary, making him the North American champion. And so you get this idea that, for starters, Big Daddy Ritter, a womanizing, white womanizing, that's a very specific white womanizing black stud. Now, when they talk about later, we're going to talk about him apparently being paid to have sex with female fans. Did Stu Hart know that? Because that's what this character sounds like. This character sounds like a black pimp, who gets paid by chicks to bang them. Was this something that was so well known that Stu Hart decided to make it a gimmick? I don't know. We'll talk about that a little bit more though. But here we find out that Junkyard Dog is already on steroids, and Dynamite Kid was already on steroids. There are some people who tend to believe that the Bulldogs took steroids to make it in WWF. Wrong. They were doing steroids in the 80s, in the early 80s, before they went to the WWF. So everybody who has this idea that Vince sort of allowed the Bulldogs to do steroids, no. That didn't happen. It did not occur. Okay. All right. So they also talk about the other kinds of drugs that he brought. And he says, quote, Dynamite also discovered speed around this time. Jake Roberts, a wrestler from Georgia, brought in to feud with Ritter, gave him a yellow jacket before he climbed in the ring one night during the 1979 Calgary Stampede. Dynamite wrestled a 1-hour match that evening and walked away with energy to spare. Both Roberts and Ritter went on to worldwide fame in the 1980s working for the WWF. Ritter as the Junkyard Dog and Roberts as Jake the Snake, a grappler who brought a 12-foot python to the ring, draping it over his victims. Now, so in Dark Side of the Ring, Jake the Snake Roberts basically said that Junkyard Dog was before him when it comes to the speed, that he had big jars of speed with him at one point. But since Dark Side of the Ring doesn't really get into details in terms of when that would have been, what the date of that would have been. So we're assuming that Jake the Snake Roberts introduced drugs into Calgary when he might have been introduced to those drugs before he even got to Calgary. And it is also possible that Junkyard Dog was already doing those drugs when he got to Calgary. All right? Because we already know he's already on steroids. So that was all very interesting. So understand, when he started smoking crack and all that kind of stuff, which was before he got to the WWF, he started to slack off. He had already become incredibly successful. He was moderately successful in Calgary. Then he was a huge success in Mid-South. He had money, he had fame, everybody knew who he was. He was getting drugs, sex, and basically just took it and ran it into the ground. So by the time he got the big money, the cash in, when he got to WWF, he had already lived a life of luxury for a little while already, and he was already on drugs. Now, this led to him not working out as much, not taking care of himself, and that's the number one reason, well, probably number two reason, number one being him no-showing events, which is probably due to, drug abuse and stuff like that, him probably falling asleep. If you're up smoking crack for 2 or 3 days and you finally come down and go to sleep or whatever, it might be hard to wake you up, but ultimately, when they started telling this stuff about, and it was Tony Atlas, oh, Vince Sr., there was all these non-white guys. It was just Bob Backlund. He was the only white guy. There was a bunch of other people. A bunch of, the Wild Samoans, Jimmy Snuka. Who else did he use? I think he maybe even himself, Rocky Johnson, Pedro Morales. And then there was, Bob Backlund, the white guy who was the world champion. And he was the only one. And then Vince Jr. takes over and everything flips. Now it's all the white guys. It's Roddy Piper. It's Bret Hart. It's, Bret Hart was in the 90s. Tony Atlas is getting a little weird here. But you kind of ignore that Superfly Snuka got entrapped in a murder like the late 80s, okay? Like, that's kind of a big deal that one of your top non-white guys got caught up in murder. Another one, the Junkyard Dog, who you specifically brought in to be a big star in this territory, is smoking crack and gaining weight. Now, he still got the charisma and the personality, and you can sell that. But the physique was gone. At that point, the physique was gone. Now, the Junkyard Dog's nephew was like kind of diminishing this argument, saying, well, everybody was doing drugs. Like, why was he the only one? The company just wasn't ready to go with a black guy. And I'm saying to myself, all right, let's do the math. Whenever somebody brings race into this subject, I always want to take a little bit of time to think about it, because it always could be racism, or as Tony Atlas says, it's not racism, it's just business. It could be that too. Let's take into account what happened. August 1984, the Junkyard Dog leaves Mid-South Wrestling, goes to the WWF. January 1984, Hulk Hogan pinned the Iron Sheik. So that means, 7 months into Hulkamania, the Junkyard Dog comes in. Hulk Hogan ended up being a top guy for 5 years. Sorry, the Junkyard Dog was a little late to the party. He was always going to be a second or third tier guy, depending on, his talent level. So then when you take into account that Junkyard Dog was the top star in Mid-South Wrestling, and now he's a big fish in a small pond. I know it's really weird to say that, because New Orleans is not a small city, but it's not New York City, right? That's like Hulk Hogan was a big star in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but he got the jump on Junkyard Dog because he was there first, right? So Hogan was already in place when Junkyard Dog comes in. What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to just basically give Junkyard Dog the title and take it away from Hulk Hogan? Be honest with yourself. Is that logical? No, it's not logical. It's not like it was 1994 and Junkyard Dog is coming straight off of a hot streak in Mid-South and Hogan is wearing down and there's really nobody to take his place. And then we just say, screw it, we're not going to go with the black guy. They had Hulk Hogan, they had Roddy Piper, they had Randy Savage, they were still using Snuka. Even though Snuka had gotten himself into some trouble, they were still using Snuka. They were still using Don Morocco. Adrian Adonis was coming in. There was still quite a few guys. Paul Orndorff was in and out of there. All these guys were big stars where they came from. Kamala was another one, was a pretty big star where he had come from. And these guys were trying to work with Hogan. The Iron Sheik was a big star too. When you have a lot of big stars, like a lot of top guys, it's hard to look at it and say that you are among the tippy top of those top guys. Right? That's a difficult thing to do. It's hard to argue. Now, a lot of those guys ended up being white. That's absolutely true. You want to make the argument that Vince Jr. preferred the multi-ethnic contingent, which kind of fit the world outside your window of New York, I guess you could say. Okay, I'm willing to accept that. But there's no way I can make the argument that Junkyard Dog should have been a top guy over Hulk Hogan. I can't make that argument. Now, if he'd have come in like the Ultimate Warrior, again, Ultimate Warrior's body didn't change. He came in chiseled out of granite. He ran out chiseled out of granite. When people saw footage, if you were to go and watch matches of the Junkyard Dog, 1982, 1983, early 1984. He looked amazing. He was in great shape. Now, he was never chiseled and cut the way Ultimate Warrior was, but he was a big guy. By 1984, 85, they started calling him the junk food dog. This is something that Dave Meltzer came up with. Well, Dave Meltzer was one of his friends. He claimed came up with the junk food dog moniker because Junkyard Dog had gotten fat. It was even something they was talking about on Mid-South, that Junkyard Dog wasn't as muscular as he used to be. Part of that was his diet. He had started eating a lot of junk food. But a part of it is he wasn't working out because he was too busy doing drugs. He basically, what happened to him is the same thing that happened to, which Wayne's brother was in The Great White Hope? When he laid around and got fat. That's basically what happened. Same thing happened to Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson, when he became heavyweight champion of the world, he decided he was going to chill. And then Kid Dynamite, the stocky Mike Tyson that everybody has in their mind, that guy didn't even really exist in the 90s. There was an element of Mike didn't take, Buster Douglas seriously. He laid around, got fat, was, doing all kinds of drugs and everything. Went in there and got himself knocked out because he wasn't in shape. Similar thing happened to Junkyard Dog. He was a guy who came from nothing, got tons and tons of success. He got a little bit lazy. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say that he got too comfortable. And now he's got to go somewhere else where he doesn't have that equity that he had in New Orleans. And therefore, it doesn't work the same. So I think that's fair. I don't know if we want to say it was racially motivated. But to me, it was fair. Now, another little racial issue they talked about here involves Bill Watts. Now, Bill Watts is always portrayed as being a racist, even though he was the only white promoter that was willing to push a top guy being black and booked him specifically to benefit the black audience. Now, in the book, King of New Orleans, Watts said, they're quoting Bill Watts from another book, which is Sex, Lies, and Headlocks. It says, "I knew a black would draw blacks," Watts said, "but the real secret was not letting a white man save a black man. I put JYD in situations that were fucking impossible. And he'd always save himself. And guess what? The whites loved him for it. Everyone loved him for it. He was a black man who was his own man." So, the way they put things together, Bill Watts is, of course, an incredible racist. If you actually read the book, you'll know that the racist was actually Leroy McGurk. Leroy McGurk, who was blind and was the owner of what was called Tri-State Wrestling before Bill Watts bought into the territory and he became Mid-South. He didn't like black wrestlers. Not really. Bill Watts not only had a black top guy in the Junkyard Dog, he had a black confidant and booker in Ernie Ladd. Ernie Ladd was a top guy in the 60s and in the 70s. Kind of somewhat, he was still wrestling in the 80s, but his knees were shot by then. And he was one of Bill Watts, not only his top guys, but his booker for a little while. So Bill Watts, who's been labeled for years, at least 30 years, as being a flaming racist because he got fired from WCW for basically saying that he should be able to fire whoever he wants, and Hank Aaron got upset about that. They continue that in this documentary while saying that Bill Watts is the only guy who is willing to make a black guy his top guy. Teddy Long comes into the episode and explains that the real reason Junkyard Dog left wasn't because of more money, but because he was hiding in a bathroom and heard Grizzly Smith, aka the father of Jake Snake Roberts, and Bill Watts having a conversation at the sink or something like that, in which Grizzly Smith let him know, "Hey, I think Junkyard Dog is going to jump to WWF." And Bill Watts says, "Well, that nigga ain't going anywhere." And that was the reason why Junkyard Dog left. And Teddy Long claims that Junkyard Dog told him that. I don't know Bill Watts. So it's entirely true that actually occurred. But my thing is, I don't think so. Bill Watts was so, like, if you ever watched old episodes of Mid-South Wrestling, Bill Watts was legitimately hurt. I'm talking, and they talked about it in this documentary, in the Vice documentary, how hurt Bill Watts was at the idea of after everything he did for Junkyard Dog to leave. What they didn't mention is that this lasted for several weeks. Week after week after week, Bill Watts would go on TV and call the Junkyard Dog a coward, that he ran away from Butch Reed, he couldn't handle it anymore, he was getting fat, he was out of shape, all this kind of stuff. It was crazy. Like the little snippet that they played of Bill Watts talking about Junkyard Dog leaving Mid-South on television, they could have shown a lot more, right? They had Butch Reed go out there and basically lambaste Junkyard Dog for weeks and weeks and weeks. The purpose of this was twofold. Not only because Bill Watts' feelings were personally hurt, but also he already knew, because it had happened before, that Vince was going to try to use the Junkyard Dog to run in Louisiana. And that's exactly what he did. So what he did is he poisoned the well. He led the people to believe that the Junkyard Dog was a coward, that he was running away, he wasn't the big star, and he didn't have it anymore, and all this kind of stuff. So that when Junkyard Dog came to Louisiana under the WWF banner, it wouldn't draw the same. And that's exactly what happened. It was very, very smart on Bill Watts' behalf. So it was a twofold thing. One, he was legitimately hurt because, again, he was the architect behind this whole thing. The Junkyard Dog name came from Bill Watts. So he really, really, really was legitimately injured, like personally hurt when Junkyard Dog left. But he also saw it as a business opportunity. An opportunity to cut the legs from up under Vince McMahon, if he could. And he successfully did so. Those years, which when WWF started running in his territory, they didn't do very well. They were spearheaded by the Junkyard Dog, but they didn't do very well. It was a typical thing for WWF to run in other people's territories, not draw a lot, at least initially, but over time, chip away at that audience. They did it in Minneapolis. They did it in St. Louis. They were doing it in Louisiana. They did it in Florida. They would go to a place. They would, of course, the local promoter would have local cachet, I guess you could say. Everybody knows who the promoter is. Everybody's familiar with more of the talent on the local show. The local audience is more emotionally attached to their local product. And that would kind of keep WWF at bay for a while. So Vince would either do a local guy that he snapped up, send them first before he sent Hogan. He usually send them first. Or he would do the Universal. He would send Andre first. And Andre usually is what bust the door down because everybody loved Andre the Giant. So that was generally what Bill Watts was thinking. Was like, if I can poison the well, Junkyard Dog cannot grow here. So you basically bleach the territory of people who like Junkyard Dog by trying to push other black wrestlers. Now, this was legitimately funny. And they talked about it in the Dark Side of the Ring, and I'm glad they did, is that after Junkyard Dog left, they tried so many different black wrestlers. Most of them were just not good enough. Butch Reed is tremendous. Butch Reed, Junkyard Dog, excellent feud between the two. They tried to push Butch Reed in that spot first. When Junkyard Dog left, it was Butch Reed that would come out there and crap all over the Junkyard Dog. And basically, he's the new man in the territory, whatever. But people still had like bad feelings about him because he was feuding with Junkyard Dog. So they were kind of like, I don't know about that. And then they brought in like Brickhouse Brown, the Snowman. Like all these random black dudes who weren't really all that well known, and they would try to use them. And now this is racism. I know this wasn't called racist, but this is racism. Just because a black man got over, doesn't mean that you could just, I say all the time on this channel, people are not interchangeable. We're not batteries, all right? A human being is not a battery. You can't just replace them when they're used up and they're gone and they're done. You can't replace them. That's racism. oh, the blacks will love the blacks. We'll just put another black in there. It doesn't work that way. it don't work that way. Sorry to break it to you. But just because you put a random muscular black man in this spot, and Tony Atlas was one of those guys too, by the way. I don't know why they didn't mention that. But to me, that did scream of racism. Well, the blacks just loves black people, so they just put the black man there. No, it didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Because there's a uniqueness to Sylvester Riddle, aka the Junkyard Dog, that made him the top guy. And you couldn't just do that with anybody. It's the same thing that Vince did with Lex Luger and Hulk Hogan, you know? He tried to just, if I made Hogan, I can make another one. It's like, no, you can't. You can't just, it's not a plug and play situation. You can't, people are not batteries. You can't just replace them. So I'm glad he talked about that. Now, let's talk about this, the thing that jumped out at me, because I had never heard this before in my life. That Junkyard Dog was sleeping with fans for money. Now, this was the one part of the episode where I was absolutely delirious, because it always happens, and I'm going to play the race card a little bit here too, that when a black man dies, that his sexual proclivities or whatever become a topic of discussion. It became that way with Malcolm X. I remember the first time I heard that Malcolm X was some kind of gay prostitute. Now, I saw some of y'all, this might be the first time you've ever heard that. Rightfully so, because I don't believe it's true. But I remember hearing about that long after Malcolm X died, that he was a gay male prostitute or something like that. And I was just kind of like, why would you even bring that up? Oh, it was part of some biography that the biographer, it escapes my memory right now. Manning Marable, that was his name. He wrote this provocative piece about Malcolm X being a gay male prostitute. Well, being a male prostitute who perhaps dabbled in homosexuality. And I was just kind of like, why do they wait for everybody to die to do stuff like this? So now they're doing it to the Junkyard Dog. They're like, okay, well, he used to get a hotel room, call some girls over. They would pay him to not only have sex with them, but also for access to the boys. So then Tony Atlas, who it was part of this apparently, was in this documentary talking about it, and said that he basically used it as an opportunity to feel into his foot fetish. That he basically didn't have sex with any of these groupies. He liked to play with their feet. So this whole thing is just blowing my mind. Because I'm sitting here thinking about it, saying to myself, like, oh my goodness, he was selling himself to groupies. I guess that's good because they're female, but also he was pimping the boys out too. Well, why would the boys go along with this? Now I can see why. Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they just wanted some pussy. They didn't care, but it just seems so weird to me that they're watching him get paid so that they can party with these chicks. Now, of course, he's the draw, right? He's the draw. He want a piece of the door, you know? It's all so gross, man. But I never read this anywhere. I never read anywhere that he was having sex with fans for money. I never read that anywhere. Is it true? Well, wrestlers have been known to do weird things for money. It's not unlikely that it would happen, I guess. Also, once you had a gimmick based on that, I would imagine it probably has some truth to it. So the following passage is from the book, The King of New Orleans. It says, in Germany, he being Sylvester Ritter, aka the Junkyard Dog, met Stu's oldest son, Bruce Hart, who handled the booking and office duties for Stampede Wrestling. Bruce hired Ritter, brought him to Calgary, and gave him his first main event push in the business. They nicknamed him Big Daddy Ritter and gave him a gimmick that borderlined on offensive. He was portraying as the big black womanizer. Ladd himself would play the role at various points in his career as a bad guy, but more regularly his success came from simply being a monster heel who could crush smaller, often white opponents. The gimmick worked well enough in Roughneck Canada. Ritter won his first singles title, the Calgary version of the North American title, and enjoyed his first stint headlining. In fact, the gimmick worked so well that long after Ritter had left Calgary, they were still using a variation of it with longtime Calgary heel Bad News Allen. Later, they continued by this being Greg Klein, repackaged as Big Daddy and given a borderline racist gimmick as a black man with a taste for white women. Ritter got a big push in Calgary. On December 1st, 1978, he won his first singles belt, beating Alo Lelania for the Calgary version of the North American title. For much of the rest of the year, Ritter was in the mix of the top Calgary circuit, married to Jake the Snake Roberts. Married means he's just basically working with him all the time. So they're basically just talking about how this gimmick was somewhat racist and offensive, or how it should have been, even though apparently this was his real life. This was something he was really doing. And this is something that his nephew and some of his friends, like Tony Atlas, was talking about, that he was being paid by women to have sex with them. It was crazy. It was nuts. So that legitimately blew my mind. And that's part of the episode really that kind of surprised me. So all in all, though, I thought this episode was really, really good. I thought it was great. It gave you a lot about the spirit of the Junkyard Dog, what made him successful. I would have liked for them to have gotten the writer from the King of New Orleans, got him involved with this piece, instead of bringing in people like, I don't know, like Teddy Long. Like, it's good to have the opinion of Teddy Long and Coco Beware as black wrestlers in the Territory era, but there's something, I think, missing. There's a lot of detail, and Dark Side of the Ring is always missing, fudging the dates and fudging details and what happened first and when did this occur and all this kind of stuff. Like, I don't think there was any major things that they missed in terms of the Junkyard Dog story, but I still think there was probably more they could have gotten out of this had they really wanted to. Maybe telling the story of how the Junkyard Dog got his name would have been interesting too. I'll give it very quickly as I wrap things up. It says, even the initial characterization of the Junkyard Dog had changed. When Ritter arrived from Calgary for his tryout, all jacked up and athletic, Watt said he couldn't think of anything but Pat Croce's song Bad Bad Leroy Brown. The song had already been used in wrestling, first as a man named Leroy Rochester took the wrestling name Leroy Brown from it. When Watts heard the song, he focused on the line in which Leroy Brown was called meaner than a junkyard dog. Simple as that, Mid-South's hero had a name. And that was the Junkyard Dog, Sylvester Ritter. Great episode of Dark Side of the Ring. What did you guys think? Like, share, subscribe. Make sure you're still subscribed because some people are saying that they were getting bumped. Let me know what you guys think about this, and I'll talk to you guys later.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, Daddy.